Good morning. Welcome to our Bible study this morning. This morning we'll be looking at familiarizing ourselves with the Bible. We'll be starting our series by looking at the Old Testament. We'll be giving just some general information about the Old Testament, hopefully to help each one of us to come to a better understanding of the books of the Bible and what information each book contains. As we progress in this series, we're going to be using a diagram that will show you a listing of the Old Testament books and the New Testament books and some information about each book. You'll be able to download a spreadsheet from my blog. To get that spreadsheet, simply go to settledinheaven.wordpress.com. Look up the series on Familiarize Yourself with the Bible. And in the context of that series, you'll be able to get information on how to download the Excel or the PDF file if you would like to help you with this series. So beginning right now, we're looking at the Old Testament, trying to familiarize ourselves with the Bible. We are now continuing our study of the Old Testament books by looking at the different books of the Old Testament and some of the major events that they cover. You can see once again in front of you on the screen we have a chart that contains the books of the Old Testament. Let's begin with the books of the Pentateuch. Once again, if you remember, the books of the Pentateuch are Genesis through Deuteronomy. The book of Genesis. The word Genesis means beginnings, and this book was aptly named because in this book we find the beginnings of many different things. We find in the book of Genesis the beginning of the world. That's when God created the world. We also find the beginning of sin, when Adam and Eve fell in the Garden of Eden. We also read about Noah's flood in the book of Genesis. We read about the Tower of Babel. It was at the Tower of Babel, if you remember, that both the nations of the world and the different languages of the world began. We read about God making his promise or his covenant to Abraham. That effectively formed the beginning of the nation of Israel. And finally, we're going to read about the Israelites traveling into Egypt because of a great famine in the land. All of those are just some of the many different events you read about in the book of Genesis. Once the Israelites entered into the land of Egypt, as time progressed, the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites. That's where the book of Exodus picks up. The book of Exodus picks up with the Israelites under Egyptian bondage as the Israelites are praying to God for deliverance. Well, in the book of Exodus, we read about that deliverance that God gave to the Israelites. Through the use of the 10 plagues, God delivered the Israelites from the bondage of the Egyptians. And then the Israelites begin their journey through the wilderness, taking them from the land of Egypt back to their promised land. That journey in the wilderness is not only covered in Exodus, but also Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So if you want to read about the Israelites' deliverance from the land of Egypt, those are the books to read. All of those books, once again, Exodus through Deuteronomy, speak of the exodus of Israel from Egypt. Okay, as we go on then, the book of Joshua. That describes the Israelites actually entering into the promised land and dividing the land among the 12 tribes of Israel. So that's basically what Joshua is about, how the Israelites enter the promised land, they war with the inhabitants of the promised land, they take the promised land for themselves because remember God had promised it to them originally when he made his promise to Abraham. And then they divide up the promised land among the 12 tribes of Israel. That's all covered in Joshua. Once they take control of the land and they have it divided, they set up a system of rulers called judges. That's what the book of Judges talks about, how the different judges rule over the nation of Israel. The book of Ruth is the story of a lady named Ruth. She lived at the same time as the judges lived. So basically, the book of Ruth and the book of Judges take place historically during basically the same time period. Okay, if you remember, the Israelites are not happy with the judges. They decide that they want a king. So, in the latter part of the book of Samuel, in all of 2nd Samuel, well, let's do it like this. In the latter part of 1st Samuel, you read about the very first king that reigned over Israel. That's King Saul. So the first part of Samuel is talking about the time period of the judges yet. Okay, it carries over from the book of Judges into the first part of 1 Samuel. That's the time period of the judges. The second part of Samuel, about in chapter 8 on, we're looking at the reign of King Saul. That's the first king of the nation of Israel. In 2 Samuel, you read about the reign of King David. He was the second king of Israel. Not only do you read about King David, but you also read about King David in the book of 1 Chronicles. So 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles basically talk about the same time frame when King David ruled over the land of Israel. In 1 Kings, the first part of the book of 1 Kings, you read about the reign of King Solomon. He was the third king over the united nation of Israel. So basically, King Saul you read about in 1 Samuel. He was the first king. The second king was King David. You read about him in 2 Samuel. And in the first part of 1 Kings, in about the first 11 chapters, you read about the third king of the united nation of Israel, King Solomon. You can also read about the reign of King Solomon in the first part of 2 Chronicles. So the first part of 1 Kings and the first part of 2 Chronicles describes basically the same time frame when King Solomon was reigning over Israel. After King Solomon's reign, the nation is split into two parts. You have the nation of Israel divided into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was described or called Israel. Its capital was in the city of Samaria. The southern part of the nation of Israel was called the kingdom of Judah. Its capital was the city of Jerusalem. So after the reign of King Solomon, you now have Israel split into two parts. A north kingdom called Israel, whose capital was Samaria. You have a southern kingdom named Judah, whose capital is Jerusalem. That's where the last part of 1 Kings takes over. 1 Kings, about chapter 12 on, talks about the history of the divided kingdom. Likewise, the last part of 2 Chronicles, that too describes the history of the divided kingdom with its various kings. So basically what you have is this. One more time, you've got 1 Samuel. The last part of 1 Samuel talks about the reign of King Saul. You have all of 2 Samuel talking about the reign of King David. You have the first part of 1 Kings talking about the reign of Solomon. And from that point forward then in Kings, from the middle of 1 Kings through 2 Kings, you have the divided kingdom talked about. In 1 Chronicles, you read about the reign of King David. In 2 Chronicles, the first part of 2 Chronicles, you read about the reign of King Saul. And the rest of the book of Chronicles, or the rest of the book of 2 Chronicles, you read about the divided kingdom. I know this is confusing, but again, if you get my worksheet downloaded from my website at settledinheaven.wordpress.com, it'll help you because I have all this illustrated for you so you can see. Okay, I also have it in outline form in my blog lesson. This is found in lesson number 3. So if you download lesson number 3, it'll give you all of this information in outline form, and hopefully it will help you to see how all this fits together. Okay, so you have all of those events in the history of the divided nation of Israel being covered through the end of 2nd Chronicles and through the end of 2nd Kings. Okay, finally then, the last books of history that we find are Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Now keep in mind, please, after the nation divides, both the north kingdom and the south kingdom have a line of kings, one after the other, that reigns over their individual segments of Israel. The north kingdom Israel is overtaken by a country called Assyria. Later in history, a country called Babylon, or actually both of those were world empires, the world empire of Babylon took over not only the world empire of Syria, which contained Israel, but they also took over the southern half of Israel called Judah. So eventually what happens is this: Israel divides up. They have a line of kings, both to the north and to the south kingdoms of Israel. Eventually, over a series of events, you have both the north and the south part of Israel being placed under the dominion of the Babylonian kingdom. Okay, this is where Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther come in. Babylon reigns over Israel. And once again, just like when Israel was under the reign of Egypt, the Israelites pray to God for deliverance from Babylon. What happens? God raises up a nation called Medo-Persia. They take over Babylon, and they allow the Israelites to return back to their home and to rebuild their temple and their walls. You can read about the rebuilding process of the temple and the walls when the nation of Medo-Persia allows the Israelites to return to their land and begin to worship their God once again. You can read about that in Ezra, Nehemiah, and the book of Esther. All three of those take place in the same time frame. It's the time frame of the rebuilding of the temple and the walls after the Israelites have been delivered from the Babylonian captivity. So in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, you can read about that time frame. When they're delivered back, the Lord allows them by grace to rebuild their temple and their walls, and they once again can worship Jehovah. That's Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther covers that time period. Okay, that's the end of the book of history. Now, the book of poetry, like I said, those are just different poems and different works that were written at various time frames. Like, remember, we said the book of Job was written by Moses, so you can tell that was basically during the time of Genesis through Deuteronomy, is when that book was written. We said that David wrote the book of Psalms, so the majority of that book was written during David's reign over Israel. We said that Solomon wrote Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. So those three books, for the most part, were written during the time that Solomon was reigning over Israel. He was the third king of the United Nation of Israel. So, as you can see, these poetry books, they just fit in at different time frames in history based on who wrote these books. So they just add to the historical accounts we already looked at. They just add more detail to those, and it helps to give us more background to the people who were living back then, as well as more lessons about Christ. Because remember, all of this is pointing us to Christ. All of these writings, either through symbols, through prophecies, or through historical accounts, point us to Jesus Christ. Okay, then the major prophets as well. They all prophesied at different times in history. They prophesied concerning the events that would be future to them, but now to us, they're in the past. Let me run down through just some of these very quickly. Remember how we talked about how the northern nation of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, is taken captive by Assyria. Remember we talked about that? After the Israelite nation divides up into a north and south kingdom, Assyria takes over the north kingdom. Okay, these are the prophets that prophesied concerning those times. Joel, Jonah, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah. Now again, you can get this whole list in my blog, so I'm trying not to go too fast with these, but if you can't keep up, keep in mind you have this all in writing in my blog, in the lessons there. Those were the prophets that prophesied during, or they prophesied about, the takeover of Assyria, by Assyria of the northern kingdom of Israel. Okay, remember we talked about how the southern kingdom of Judah was overtaken by Babylon. Here are the prophets that wrote about that. Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah, Nahum, Zephaniah, Ezekiel, Habakkuk, Obadiah, and Lamentations. All of those are prophecies that were written about Babylon coming in, taking over the southern kingdom of Israel. Then finally, if you remember, we talked about how Medo-Persia at a later point in time took over Babylon and allowed the Israelites to return back to their home and to rebuild the temple and the walls. Here's some of the prophets that wrote about that. Daniel, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Okay, those were the prophets that wrote about that time period when Israel went back home, built their temple, and built their walls. Okay, that's a very basic, quick overview of the events, the important events that are covered by the books of the Old Testament. I hope it helps maybe to clarify just a little bit what books talk about what events and also the time frame of each of those. Thank you very much.